We see Ghana, of course, rising, as I mentioned earlier, but we see it too. Remember, being an empire over what? Other tribal groups. So there's always what I call a centrifugal force involved there. Of the tendency of the empire always to do what? Fly apart. That's why you have to have top-notch what? Administration. You have to have a top-notch political system. You have to have a top-notch intelligence gathering system. You have to have a way of paying your army and raising your armies. Now, when your empire grows too big for your army to control, that empire falls apart. We saw that to a great extent with the Ghanaian situation. We'll find it with the Malian situation as well. We also see, of course, what's happening in the Ghanaian situation. And yet now, ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about a civilization that lasted well over, what, 1,000 years. You know, no fly-by-night group you're dealing with. And really, if you count its full history, probably going on over 2,000 years. Certainly existing beyond the time when the last African Egyptian dynasty was still on the throne in Egypt. And yet we see then what is happening again, as Chancellor Williams points out again and again. The inculcation into its midst, what? Of foreigners. Into its midst, foreign religion. Kings who begin to say, out of expediency, I will become a Muslim. All right, let's deal with the reality. I know some of you don't want to deal with it. Yeah, out of expediency. Because remember, the whole African population is not Muslim. So that brings what? A seed of dissension where? Right into your society. The ruling class, the powerful group, the king is Muslim, and what? The population is still what? Non-Muslim. Problems there. Other groups outside, non-Muslim. Or other groups under your domination, what? Non-Muslim. Problems. Muslims controlling the caravans routes. Muslims having to be what? Bribed. Muslims controlling to a good extent some a trade and so forth. And we call that expediency. But look at it very carefully. It was expedient for the Arabs, not for the Africans. It was expedient for them to say what? We will only trade with whom? Muslims. We will only give what? The Muslims the best deals and so forth. It worked for whose benefit? For the Arab benefit. And yet we have history that's saying that African kings became Muslims out of what? Expediency. And we're going to watch that game because it goes right on down to today. Of people choosing other people's philosophies out of expediency. We see then the decline of Songhai, and I won't go into all of that, but the thing that I want you to recognize as we review these things, of course Songhai becomes of some interest in the sense that its downfall, of course, while subject to the problem of all empires, whether black, green, yellow, blue, or what have you, and that is maintaining control through military means, through administrative means, through political means, the capacity to protect one's empire. And remember, you see, one of the other things that changes empires, of course, is technique. As I just mentioned, the change in formations, the change in religious strategy, in military strategy, changes in military weaponry can tip the balance toward in the favor of an enemy. And sometimes a society which has been great permits itself to become conservative and therefore does not change its military strategy, does not change its philosophies and so forth, and another people with a different philosophy, strategy, technique, and military approach overruns that society, even if the civilization is a what? A good one, quote unquote, as such. And we see that. So what do we see here with the decline of Songhai? The Sultan of Morocco sending a force of 200 soldiers, seizing the salt deposits of Tagaza, armed with what so-called arquebuses, or what we call the musket. And now the gun is being introduced into African society. And this introduction of the gun and the weapon of the rifle and so forth, is going to tip this balance greatly. Prior to this time, the African armies and the other armies could, and the empirical armies of Africa could withstand the onslaught of Europeans, and they did, century after century after century. And they were equal to the fighting valor of the other peoples. But with the introduction of these weapons, we see then the military situation changing. And these guns were to bring about profound changes. And we see then the people from Songhai losing battle after battle against these weapons. I would recommend for you a reading of a book called The Tools of Empire by Hedrick. I can't recall his first name. An interesting one where he talks then about the effects of the rifle, the effects of the gun, particularly as it moved from the musket, which had to be loaded from its bore, from the upper end where the soldier had to stand up, and sometimes it took him a whole minute to load it and get it. You know, you've seen these pictures where they had to drop the powder in and drop the bullet in and drop, you know, and tamp. And then you see, and so an army with a good bow and arrow cord could still do them in. And in fact, the accuracy of these weapons being smooth bored without the rifling on the inside of the chamber were very inaccurate. And some of them, they weren't accurate up to about 80 feet. And a good strong bow was more accurate from a longer distance. But after a while, and many of them would just stop firing when they got wet. You know, that would be the end of this, or when they had moisture and so forth. But technique, you see, begins to take place, doesn't it? The building of the metal cartridge, the breech loader, which really transformed warfare. Instead of having to stand up and push that powder down and the other stuff down in there, you load the bullet at the front, at the end of the gun nearest to the firing person. Very important, because it permits him to lay down, to hide out, to lay low in ambush, and to fire from a prone position. And as you rifle the inside of that barrel so that the bullet comes out spinning, you see, instead of tumbling in upon end and so forth, you increase the speed and you increase its effectiveness and its distance, so that when you could get a small group of men put into a Latin square and so forth with that kind of rifling and that kind of gun and wreak havoc on a bunch of people running with spears and assegais, as did happen. And then when you add on to that the machine gun, particularly the magazine gun, 3 or 4 of those could kill men by the thousands. And you have situations then of 400 and 500 Europeans killing Ashantis and other people in terms of thousands by the tens of thousands. Technology and technique. Now the African tries to develop the weapon too. And some even went as far as to send their locksmith, their blacksmith to Europe to try to learn that affair. You talk about Samori Touré, who sought to make weapons and sent his blacksmiths to Europe to learn the craft. To Wodros tried to do the same as well. But then you still had the factors operating there that you have now. The European armies, as they got new weapons, would do what with their old weapons? Sell them to the Africans. And actually what they did in many instances, Africans were importing weapons by the thousands, hundreds of thousands, particularly the West Africans and so forth. The only problem was that they were what? No good. Blow up in your face. Cheap. You see? Very. But it's the same thing the Europeans do today.
That's right.
When the Africans buy jet planes, they're not buying the whole thing. They are so-called what? Defensive weapons. A good part of the jet equipment is left off. The parts that will allow them to be offensive and to attack and so forth are not sold to them. Only, you know what's ultimately sold to them? The same thing that was sold to our African forefathers. Enough so that they could do what? Kill each other. Yeah. or so some dictator like Mobutu or some of those other rascals over there could intimidate the population and rape and rob them in service to their European overlords. The game is a heavy one, and it continues. And I can see Chancellor Williams' frustration. When are we going to learn? When are we going to study that history and look at it for what it is? When are we going to get off this religious trip and look at the human factors involved in the rise and falls of human civilizations and grow and develop with that kind of knowledge? When are we going to get over the glorification bag and really look at the realities of things and develop our defense and our survival on the basis of reality? And recognize that we must get ready to challenge this European militarily, psychologically, politically, and in every other way possible, and that we are fully capable of doing it. We must look over and get over the guard trip and recognize that there are human factors involved in the survival of a people.